Tena koto katoa ko Lisa Ellis toko ingwa no mai harimai kite o tako whakaihu waka. Welcome to the Carle Distinguished Lecture for Semester 2. It is absolutely wonderful to see you all here. I want to say a few thanks first. Thanks very much to the de Carle family for sponsoring this endowment. Thank you to the Division of Humanities for making this possible. Thank you to the philosophy program, and thank you most especially to Karen McLean, without whom none of this would be possible. Kia ora, people of Otipoti. Kia ora, people streaming online. Kia ora, members of the university community. Kia ora koto. Professor Sungmoon Kim, tēnā koe. It is my great pleasure to welcome our de Carle Distinguished Lecturer, Professor Sungmoon Kim of the City University of Hong Kong. Professor Kim is Chair Professor of Political Philosophy and Director of the Center for East Asian and Comparative Philosophy at City University. He is the author of, most recently, 6 solo-authored books, innumerable articles and edited collections. All 6 of his solo-authored books were published by either Cambridge or Oxford University Press. His most recent book is entitled Confucian Constitutionalism, Dignity, Rights, and Democracy. Professor Kim holds a bachelor's degree from Yonsei University, a master's degree from the Korean Academy of Sciences? Did I get that wrong? Academy of Korean Studies, excuse me. And a PhD from the University of Maryland, College Park. He has been affiliated with the Edmund Safra Center at Harvard University and with the Center for Comparative Philosophy at Duke. And he is on Stanford's list of the top 2% most cited scientists. But way back when I met Sungmoon, nearly 20 years ago now, he was just setting out to do all these things, barely beginning to finish his PhD. We met at the Association for Political Theory, which we've just this afternoon agreed is the best conference. And when we were there, we discussed the possibilities for the equality between men and women in the Korean clan system. And even now, Professor Kim is still writing on that topic, among many other topics. I am really looking forward to today's lecture, where we're going to hear ideas about power in the Confucian context. But I think I have talked long enough. No reira, tēnā koto katoa. Please help me in welcoming Professor Kim to the podium.
Okay. Thank you, Lisa, for very nice, generous introduction. I'm very honored and pleased to be here delivering the Carle lecture for the community of Otago. So thank you so much for a very kind and generous invitation. I'll be talking about Confucianism and, of course, power and responsibility. And I suspect many of you tend to think Confucianism is something about China. Although I must say, in the same way, whenever we study Aristotle, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, we're not just associating these people, giants in Western philosophy, with Greek tradition alone, right? They are philosophers for the Western civilization and philosophical and political traditions as well. So as a South Korean native, I must say Confucianism is universal, what used to be universal culture for East Asians, from mainland China, of course, South Korea, both Koreas, Japan, Vietnam. All these people were profoundly influenced by this culture and civilization. So I'm not talking about Chinese philosophy per se. I'm going to be talking about what East Asian used to deem to be a universal philosophy and what this tradition can teach us, East Asian and people outside the region, okay? One of the things that motivated me to study this particular topic was why I'm political theory. So when we study political theory in the Western tradition, we basically start with Plato, Aristotle, and one of the major topics that we are studying is about regime changes, right? We have monarchy, we have aristocracy, we have democracy, we have the tyranny and oligarchy and autocracy, the mob rule. Why we have this change of regimes, right? What caused the change of regimes and how we define regimes? One man holding all power, group of individuals holding power, or many people. We don't have that change in East Asia. If you can see, China, Japan, a little bit different, but Korea and Vietnam, from the get-go history, from the beginning until we encountered with the so-called West, recently, 150 years ago, 200 years ago, only one type of regime, basically one-man monarchy. Of course, exceptional, we had several queens, but basically one-man monarch. Why East Asians, especially in the Confucian tradition, didn't experience a lot of regime change of the sort that defined the Western tradition? Why East Asians, especially in the Confucian culture, didn't develop the kinds of ideas or practice like constitutionalism or separation of powers? What's wrong with them? Well, what's the reason that they didn't have to bother to think about these problems or these issues that, again, arguably define the Western political culture and tradition and civilization? That then motivated me to venture into this particular topic. So I'll try to share my reflections with you guys and see what kind of implication we can draw from my reflection for the political life and practice in the contemporary East Asian context. Perhaps some of my reflection might be relevant to your struggle with how to make our society and the world maybe a little bit better, okay? So let me start with this lecture. Okay, so if you look at Plato, Aristotle, Kant, of course, Rousseau, Hobbes, Machiavelli, they are all arguably theorists of power and theorists of regime and theorists of institutions and theorists of virtue as well. But if you think about East Asian tradition, especially Confucian tradition, it's really, really difficult to come up with one name as a theorist of power. We have a lot of theorists and philosophers and intellectuals of virtue, richer. I mean, for East Asian, richer is extremely difficult. I cannot stand like here in front of my senior professors, right? I cannot even. Richer education, the state was viewed as one large family or school, right? One of the most important roles for the ruler was to educate people, make people better. In order to do so, the ruler himself had to correct himself and become good in order to inspire people to follow his lead. Self-cultivation, moral self-cultivation. So if you study Confucianism, Chinese philosophy, East Asian philosophy in general, you see a bunch of theories and arguments and essays and discussions, debates about virtue, richer education, self-cultivation, and many things and so forth. But not about power. Even it's really hard to translate power in Chinese, classical Chinese. We have a bunch of terms that represent, they express this particular human phenomena, but we don't have a particular very well-defined concept that can be equivalent to power that we use in English. So if we don't have a theory about power, can we think about Confucian political theory? Can we think about political theory without thinking about power, without positing the well-defined concept of power? So all these things invited me to venture into this particular topic. And it has also implications for other issues like legitimacy, political legitimacy, authority, political obligation, justice, constitutionalism, separation of powers, without assuming the concept or the kind of power. Can we reasonably think about all these normative questions intelligibly? That's the question that I'm grappling with. So Confucianism. So as I said, Confucianism is mainly about virtue. in Anglophone academic world, especially in the philosophy department, if you have at least one or two philosophers, they are specializing in virtue, virtue ethics. Because many Confucian students of Confucianism, scholars of Confucianism, tend to understand Confucianism as kind of a virtue ethics of the sort Aristotle, eudaimonia virtue ethics, right? How to live a flourishing life, moral life. So from the beginning of the tradition, the idea of power was displaced. It doesn't mean that Chinese people, East Asian people, didn't have any account of power. Of course, there is a king, right? Of course, there is a course of power. Of course, there is law, and especially penal code and state. But in the mainstream ethical and political discourse, the account of power, the concept of power, was rapidly displaced, and it was replaced by concepts like virtue. Okay. So if you read East Asian, especially Confucian traditions, what you notice is ideas and stories about sage king. It's like a East Asian Confucian equivalent of a philosopher king. But what's distinctive about this idea is that the king is the paragon of virtue, moral virtue, especially humaneness, benevolence. People call Ren, this Chinese character, Ren, humaneness, or filial piety, and filial piety, righteousness, ritual propriety, and wisdom. These are cardinal human virtues, and the king should be the embodiment of these cardinal human virtues, the virtues that make you authentic human beings. Okay? And then there's no founding myth. There is no Romulus, or there is no Caesar. Basically, one right guy, the virtuous guy, handing over the throne to another right guy. There's no power struggle whatsoever. So William Dewberry, one of the major figures in contemporary Confucianism or Chinese philosophy at University of Columbia University, who passed away years ago, said in the Chinese myth of founding, neither conquest or struggle, neither antagonist nor rival to overcome, nor any countervailing power to be met. This is one of the most salient features of Chinese political theory. Abdication, we call in Chinese people call it shenyang. The virtuous king man hands over the throne to another virtuous man by handpicking the kind of person. So here the throne does not represent power. When we normally say in English, when we hand over the throne to next guy, next king, the throne signifies the power, right? But here, not power. So I'll come back to this, what that signifies. Of course, the answer is here at the title of my lecture today. And there is a very interesting normative dichotomy between what Chinese call the kingly way, Wang Dao, kingly way, and the way of a hegemon. The kingly way is literally the way that was conducted by the ancient sage kings, legendary sage kings, who used to hold the power through abdication, not struggle. Okay, so they are embodying humaneness, and the opposite kind of the completely contrary kind of government, style of government is called the way of a hegemon or Badao. And this is the government that adopts, the style of government that adopts the force rather than humaneness. So we have these two individuals here, two scholars here, or thinkers here, Mencius and Sun Tzu. So if you're completely foreign to Chinese East Asian philosophical tradition, Confucius is like a Socrates. And Mencius is famous for his statement that human nature is originally good. And he's like a Plato. He's the guy who actually created this whole, it's like St. Paul for Confucius, okay? And we have Sun Tzu is like Aristotle. He's an encyclopedic scholar who comprehensively restructured Chinese philosophy in a rationalist manner. And he's very famous for the argument that human nature is originally bad. So the Mencius guy is a guy who says human nature is originally good. The Sun Tzu guy is saying human nature is originally bad. Many Chinese philosophers are paying attention to their account of human nature and the implication of that its implication for moral self-cultivation. But as a political theorist, I'm much more interested in the differences that they revealed as political thinkers or political philosophers. So one thing that defines Mencius's political theory is that he was champion of the kingly way, the way conducted by legendary ancient sage kings, virtuous men, paragons of virtue, and he was against the way of a hegemon. Any government that relies on force, especially coercive power. So later, if you look at later Chinese Confucian tradition, East Asian Confucian tradition, Mencius has become the guy, okay? So like Saint Paul, okay? He become the guy. So we had this, what we call sagely line, the lineage of the way, the Tao, the true way of government. Mencius is the guy who is alleged to have found or created or discovered the lineage of way, from which Sunji, the arch-rival of Mencius, who is roughly 60 years behind him, was completely displaced. So from Han Dynasty, Tang Dynasty, later Song Dynasty, Ming Dynasty, and Korean Joseon Dynasty, all mainstream Confucians didn't bother to study Sunji. They didn't mention Sunji officially, formally, although they read Sunji, but they completely sidestepped him from the mainline mainstream Confucianism. Anyhow, because Sunji said human nature is bad. But another thing Sunji said was, we should acknowledge the way of hegemon as a reasonable way to organize the government. We cannot simply dismiss the importance of institutions over the character. We cannot simply dismiss the importance of force in dealing with what we now call collective action problems, coordination problems. We cannot simply pretend that good government solely relies on the moral character, immaculate character of the ruler. That's idealistic, good, but that's not realistic, because these thinkers are developing their ideas during the period, arguably the most turbulent period in Chinese history, what Chinese call warring stage period, okay? Zhongguo period. So Sunji thought it was unreasonable. Later, we have a guy named Zhu Xi, who was born 1130 and he died 1200. He was kind of arguably the most important thinker since 10th century AD. Neo-Confucian guy, Southern Song thinker. He developed this idea, along with many others, of course. He revolutionized Confucian tradition, and many contemporary people call that new tradition of Confucianism Neo-Confucianism, Shinryujia. And one of his key arguments as a political philosopher was Wu Wei politics. So the king, Wei literally means action, and Wu means none. So absence of action. So king, the ruler, is not supposed to do anything. He is supposed to do nothing to govern the state well. So this is paradoxical, this is ironic, but I'll explain what that actually implied. But this idea, sage king, like a polar star, and then around each multitude of stars revolve. So if your king is a charismatic guy, with virtue, then his radiant virtue will inspire the people to pay homage to him, okay? The ministers and people will just respect him, and we can spontaneously excite people spontaneously to obey this morally immaculate ruler. So all he has to do is cultivate virtue and become a good person, then everything's gonna be fine. So there is no intricate discussion about power, institutions. It's all about rulers' moral character and maybe ruling elite's moral character. So this is Chinese virtue ethics and the baseline argument of Confucian politics. Now, the Mencius, the Mencian paradigm. So Mencius advocated the kingly way, the Wangdo, and then interestingly, he defined normatively the kingly way, literally, it's a descriptive term, the way conducted by legendary ancient kings in terms of humane government, by associating the Ren, benevolent or humanist, with the style of government. Confucius is known for his advocacy of Ren. Benevolence was like a manliness. It was initially, before Confucius, it was a military virtue, manliness, basically. But then Confucius translated this virtue and made it virtue, Confucian moral virtue par excellence. It became the virtue that makes human beings humans, okay? Then now Mencius picking up with this idea and associating that idea with the style of government and calling the ideal government the kingly way, humane government. And then what defines humane government is that it is motivated by the heart mind that cannot bear to see the suffering of the people. And rulers should be able to extend this heart mind to protecting and promoting well-being of the people, all of whom were personally bestowed by heaven with good nature marked by the innate potential to become like ancient sages such as Yao and Shun. So basically, the ruler, what makes this government humane is the motivation, right? The ruler should have right motivation that comes from the heart and mind that cannot bear to see the suffering of others or the people whom the ruler should regard as his own children. Then interestingly, it has corresponding change on the idea of the way of hegemon. During the warring stage period, this ancient China, many contemporary Chinese people regarded the kingly way and the way of hegemon almost interchangeably. They thought all the practitioners of the way of hegemon were good great kings like Caesar, great kings who pacified the Chinese Middle Kingdom, who protected the Chinese king from the royal house, from the attacks from barbarians, okay? And then maintained order, internal order among the feudal lords. Then Mencius found that style of government heavily problematic because he thought that even if the way of hegemon or Bado achieving greatness in terms of our ordinary, in our ordinary sense of our political life, but since it relies on force, it's gotta be disregarded, dismissed, okay, by being identified with inhumaneness. So if humaneness predicates, buttresses the humane government, then anything that deviates from humaneness, including the government that relies on force, power, should be regarded as inhumane. There's only two ways, humaneness or inhumaneness. So even if you tend to think like a Sunji might say, oh, inhumane, even if it's not humane, still it's a doable, reasonable, decently good government because it organizes people. No, Mencius says, no, since it deviates from the right path of government, the kingly way, this should be vilified, criticized, blamed as inhumane government. Technically, there's no difference between inhumane government in this regard and tyranny or bad government. Okay, so Mencius in this regard is very subscribed to very stringent, rigorous normative dualism here. So we have a double transformation. We have Wang Dao as a humane government, then Ba Dao, the way of hegemon, which was used to be viewed quite favorably by ancient Chinese people as inhumane government. So this is how Mencius defined Ba Dao. One who, supported by force, pretends to be humane is a hegemon, and a hegemon has to have a large state. One who out of virtue practices humanity is a true king, and a true king does not need anything large, kind of thing, okay? So, as I just explained, the Sunji authorized the effective use of coercive power to the extent that it can be made to serve the well-being of the people. Of course, in order to be made to serve people, we still need the rule of character. So Sunji didn't dismiss the importance of character, but still, Sunji believed that as long as we have a good ruler should be able to utilize force in the service of the well-being of the people. Mencius was too much weary of the abuse of power in this regard, and he completely sidestepped the force, and so he vilified the way of hegemon as if it's equivalent to tyranny. Okay, so if you read open the text of Mencius, you have a lot of conversation that he conducted with the rulers of that time, and many of rulers trying to strengthen the state, military, and enrich the state, but Mencius found their efforts was simply trying to emulate the old the ways of Hesiman and finding fault with him. Okay, so we find a little bit stringent in this regard. Anyhow, but Mencius became the guy who created what we now call Chinese Confucian, East Asian Confucian tradition. So what Mencius did as a political theorist, so now he seems to be a little bit naive in dismissing the critical importance of power in organizing our political life, but he rather shifted the attention to responsibility. So in his view, he paid attention to this guy. Yin was the sagacious minister, prime minister, who helped the founder of the Shang dynasty, the ancient Shang dynasty, conquer the preceding dynasty and reunite the Chinese kingdom and became the sage king himself. He was a sagacious minister. What he did was something like this. According to Mencius, Yin thought that if among the people in the world there was a common man or common woman who did not share in the benefits of Yahweh ancient sage kings, it was as if he himself had pushed them into a ditch, thus taking himself the responsibility for the heavy weight of the world. So this responsibility for the well-being of the people falls on me as a guy. Now I'm serving this great king, this great guy to become great king, and as a minister, I have this responsibility. What is really interesting about this statement is that if you read the Confucian text, that responsibility was initially thought to be held by the king exclusively. So Yao, again, the sage king, when he was handing over the throne to next guy, Shun, the next sage king, Yao said, "Oh, Shun, the succession ordained by heaven has fallen on you. If all under heaven, the whole kingdom, whole world should be reduced to dire straits, the honors bestowed on you by heaven will be terminated forever." So basically, this is not power you actively seek. This is responsibility you basically reluctantly receive from another guy who bore this responsibility for years. And Tang, the guy who created the Shang dynasty, Yin, the guy I just mentioned, was his minister. Okay, Tang said, "I, Tang Lu, his first name, the little one, dare to offer black bull as a sacrifice, and to make this declaration before the great Lord of the God, their ancestor God. I dare not pardon those who have transgressed. If I transgress, let not 10,000 states suffer because of me. But if the 10,000 states transgress, the guilt is mine alone." Okay. So the power, when you receive power, when you conquer your predecessor, the tyrant, and you become the king, the suzerain ruler reigning over the old Chinese kingdom, what you assume is not the power per se, it's a responsibility. And now what Mencius says is that this responsibility is shared or transferred not to the sagacious minister. Okay, we'll come back to this question later. Okay, this is very important in the Chinese political tradition. Now, we have a Han dynasty. Of course, we have a Qin dynasty. The first emperor is called the Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, but it's a short-lived dynasty for only 15 years. And then we have a Han dynasty. Because Han dynasty, which lasted about 400 years, we have early Han dynasty, later Han dynasty, but Han dynasty has laid the foundation of Chinese civilization. That's why we call Chinese people Han people. We call Chinese character Han characters. Okay, so this is the foundation that the civilization that virtually created a Chinese civilization that we now identify with the Han people. When the empire finally ending the many centuries of turmoil in the Chinese Middle Kingdom, and then finally the dynasty empire arose, Confucian political theory has to adapt itself to the newly completely altered political situation, right? So there was a need to reformulate Confucian virtue of politics and the idea of humane government to be suitable for the new imperial conditions. So Shenyang, abdication doesn't make any sense, right? One virtuous guy handing over the power to another guy. Because this is predicated on hereditary kingship, right? The king gives the power to next. it's completely different political theory here. On the new political circumstances, the abdication doctrine, which I just mentioned, had become completely obsolete. And the ruler's authority as the son of heaven, grounded in the principle of the hereditary succession, had become integral to the Han doctrine of mandate of heaven. So Han rulers, the emperors, and their offsprings had the right to rule the state, the empire, as the son of heaven, because they are mandated to govern or possess the whole kingdom. Okay? So emperor was understood as the son of heaven, holding an undivided power, which was extremely important because they're now coming out of feudal period. Toward the end of warring stage period, which was about 3rd century BC, about 7 powerful states were vying for supremacy to reunify the Chinese kingdom. And then finally it was unified by the first emperor of Qin dynasty, and then it was rapidly replaced by Han dynasty. And Han emperor called himself the son of heaven, and holding the undivided power is extremely important because they didn't want to go back to this divisive political struggles that savaged the Chinese kingdom for centuries. Okay. So now Dongjungshu, if there's one name that we can identify as the greatest political theorist during the Han dynasty. Arguably, I must say, arguably, this is the guy, Dongjungshu, for 400 years. Like Cicero, Chinese Cicero. He fused the kingly way and way of hegemon. So he says, basically, the way of hegemon, Badao and Wangdao, the kingly way, are equally rooted in humaneness. This is a revolutionary statement. Because previously, Mencius believed that Wangdao, the kingly way, is predicated on the virtue of humaneness, right? And righteousness and other cardinal virtues. And even Sunji, even if he he espoused the way of hegemon as one of the reasonable ways to organize government, he didn't associate humaneness with the way of hegemon as such. But now, Dongjungshu, who thought of himself as the follower of Mencius, is now claiming that both ways of statecraft are equally based in humaneness. This is a revolutionary idea. So we shouldn't dismiss the importance of Badao. The implication is that. Okay? The way of hegemon. The rulers, so what Dongjungshu says is something like this. The ruler holds undivided power, which basically on which every Confucian basically agreed. As the son of heaven, he is a centripetal force and the pivot of the reintegrated, it's not just reintegrated political community that we call Chinese kingdom. Moral power, the Mencius advocated, and political power, Sunji kind of implicitly accepted, are fused in the hands of one man, the son of heaven, the universal imperial ruler. And then we have interesting ethic of responsible rising, reinstated, which was first noted by Mencius as pertaining to the ruler, not the minister, to the ruler, thus countervailing or counteracting Mencius' theory of sage ministership. Okay? The ruler has political responsibility, and his responsibility must not be divided between him and his ministers. In this regard, the Mencius idea of ministerial responsibility is blasphemous, okay? Because it has divisive implications. So ruler has undivided power, and that undivided power is accompanied by undivided responsibility. The second part is really important because even if there are natural disasters, according to Dongjungshu, even if there are natural disasters which are beyond human control, basically, right? The famine or flooding, earthquake. These should be understood as a warning signs from heaven, the Father of the Son of Heaven, of course, as loving invitation for a ruler to revisit his conduct of government, whether his government has been humane enough. Okay? So ruler cannot, exonerate himself from the responsibility, because he's the sole man who is supposed to bear this undivided responsibility. He cannot simply say, "Oh, this is my minister of whatever security is for, safety is for, somebody is for." No, he cannot do that. That's the price that you have to pay for as the guy who enjoys undivided power. Okay, the ruler must take responsibility, in this case, even non-causal responsibility. The problems, the sufferings people are undergoing, even if you are not the one who caused them to suffer, including natural disasters, problems including natural disasters, you should be the one who should be held liable for their suffering solely. Okay, this is a huge responsibility. It goes beyond logic of causality. Okay, all such responsibilities are the rulers. This is a really, really strong claim. So what makes Dong Jung-soo otherwise a champion of empire, undivided power, absolute kingship? What makes him still Confucian is because of his interesting reinstatement to ethic of responsibility. Okay, but still it's dangerous, right? Still it still gives a lot of power, of course, with responsibility to the ruler because of the worry of this fragmentation of the Chinese kingdom. And actually that's what happened toward the end of the Tang Dynasty. Tang Dynasty lasted from 7th century to 10th century, for about 300 years. And this is arguably the most international kind of the empires that Chinese people ever had. Very international, very cosmopolitan. But then toward the end of 10th century AD, 10th century, the Tang Dynasty collapsed because of rebellions of regional overlords. So same problems, Chinese kingdom, empire, Zhou dynasty, then we have what we call feudalism, all these regional overlords buying supremacy and then overthrow the central government, and then that exactly what happened toward the end of Tang Dynasty. And the founders of Song Dynasty was one of the overlords, the overlords. So when Song Dynasty was created, 10th century AD, all these Confucians, students of Mencius, grappled with how to address the problems Dong Jung-soo's political theory left for them. Centralization practice, centralizing practice. So we need a centralized government, of course. We agree with Dong Jung-soo in this regard, but we are weary of centralized, undivided power exercised by the ruler. So what they came up with, of course, as the students have mentioned, why don't we share, not the power, because the king wouldn't listen to us, right? But we're going to remonstrate the king to share his responsibility, because it's burdensome. His responsibility with us, because as I said, the king is liable for all these problems, including natural disasters. This is too much. So why don't you share your responsibility with us, the ministers? That way, surreptitiously, the power can be shared between the rulers and ruler and ministers. And then neo-Confucians later called that kind of rule shared rule. 준천공주, shared rule. Here, what is shared is not, technically speaking, it's not power as such, because no Confucians proposed dividing power, because it's unthinkable in the Chinese context, imperial context. But rather, what they proposed was sharing the responsibility. And then later, again, as I mentioned, Jushi came up with this idea of separation of a sage line. The virtue is assumed by the ministers, the Confucian scholars, who are immersed in the moral self-cultivation and passive examination and become the part of the government. We are the ones who have this responsibility. We are the ones who have access to the way that line starts with Confucius, who was not the king in the first place, and Mencius was not the king. So we, the scholars, assume this power. Now, the priestly line, of course, this is based on hereditary kingship, right? You have this right to govern the people by virtue of your hereditary right, but doesn't mean that you are a virtuous man. Okay, so we have this political power on the one hand, justified by priestly line, the hereditary kingship, and we have a sage line, basically the power of moral power of virtue assumed by Confucian ministers. And Confucian ministers have this right to remonstrate with the king, and they advocated Wu politics, and now basically the ruler didn't have to do anything. Okay, that I'll skip here. What this idea implied was something like this. Ministerial authority is a real engine of Confucian virtue politics. And the ruler may reign over all under heaven as a sovereign with undivided power, thus symbolizing and preserving the unity of the polity, but he should never be active in the sense of exerting his coercive political power in a way that satisfies your personal political ambition or private desires. The responsibility for the whole world must be entrusted to a group of select individuals who have a special connection to the way through their immersion in Confucian classics and moral sophistication, Confucian scholars. Okay, now this idea was developed by Jung Do-jeon, is the guy who founded. He's a scholar, neo-Confucian scholar, bureaucrat, who founded the Joseon dynasty in Korea, which was founded in 1392 and collapsed in 1910. He came up with this very intricate idea of Confucian constitutionalism. So let me be really brief. Grand Councilor, Prime Minister, has a countervailing power. If he says yes, then if the Son of Heaven says no, the Prime Minister says yes. If the Son of Heaven says yes, the Prime Minister says no. So he has right to say no, basically. It's like a lower opposition. And then remonstrance officer. If a king says yes, the remonstrance officer says no, and then same thing. So we have two organs here. One prime ministership, one what Chinese people call censorial system. The bureaucratic organ equipped with the power to remonstrate with the king with immunity. So they can remonstrate with the ruler freely. And typically they were young scholars of their early 30s. They were positioned in this bureaucratic bureau organ, and they have a right to remonstrate with the king almost freely. And the signal of autocracy is that king doesn't want to listen to their remonstrance, and they disband the individual. That's a sign of autocracy or tyranny in the Chinese context or of a Confucian context. Okay, so I've been talking long about the history of Confucian political thought. So what's the point of rediscovering the political theory of power in the Chinese or East Asian Confucian context? I have two things to share with you. First, active citizenship. So far, I haven't mentioned at all the people at all, right? We have a king, we have ministers. What about the people? In the Confucian tradition, people were conceived as barometers. They can indicate their content or discontent with the ruler. They can complain about them. They can say something about, but they have no power whatsoever. They have no right or power whatsoever to take part in the public decision-making processes at all. Okay? So they are barometers or thermometers. They are indicators, not active agents. They are passive agents. We had the kings, emperors had this responsibility for the whole world, basically the well-being of the people. And Song Neo-Confucians, Song Confucians assume that responsibility for themselves and become the agent, carriers of the way. Now I argue that that responsibility should be reassumed, reappropriated by people, Chinese people, Korean people, Japanese people, and Vietnamese people, rather than just remaining as barometers. This is revitalizing the action dimension of a Confucian responsibility of the kind which was assumed by Confucian ministers. And I also want to say that the liability dimension of a Confucian responsibility, the non-causal sense of responsibility must be actively appropriated by citizens in East Asia. Therefore, they can exercise collective moral responsibility for the problems that go beyond their individual liability, right? Like a structural injustice, like a climate change. No single person in East Asia. Now, I would say, my son is there, but it's unfair. Somebody would pinpointing me, Sungmoon, you caused global warming, or you caused the socio-economic inequality that South Korea and it's unfair, right? It's hard to pinpoint any particular individual and trying to hold him responsible. Even it's really hard to hold George W. Bush or Donald Trump or anybody and hold individually, personal responsibility liable for those problems. But that liability dimension of a Confucian responsibility, non-causal sense of responsibility of the Chinese emperors assumed for the sufferings of people after natural disaster. That kind of liability dimension of Confucian responsibility should be actively appropriated by citizens in East Asia. And without asking who caused these problems with these masses, they can assume their responsibility and deal with them, okay? We can talk a lot about these issues, but I'll skip. Finally, the second implication, that's implication 2, responsibility meritocracy. It requires a maybe 10-minute short presentation. So if you're interested in contemporary Confucian political theory, Confucian political theory is propelled by two groups of scholars. On the one hand, we have a scholars called Confucian political meritocrats, Confucian meritocrats. Their key argument is something like this. Look, if you look at Chinese history, only less than 5% of the entire Chinese population always ruled the rest of the people. Whether it's Tang Dynasty, Song Dynasty, Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty, doesn't matter. Only handful of political elites, social elites, govern the rest of the people. Why don't we replicate that now in contemporary China, in Korea, or in Singapore, or Hong Kong? So what they propose specifically, why don't we come up with a bicameralism or tricameralism, or simply bicameralism? So we have a meritocratic upper house composed of people, individuals selected non-democratic means, like a civil examination of the sort of Chinese people invented, right? What about, so you take exams and then they become your political representatives. Or recommendations. Who recommend these political representatives? Retired public officials, university professors, or judges and justices. All those reputable individuals can form this community, and this community can make recommendations for the sake of the people. And then, of course, we have a democratic law house, and if there is a gridlock, then, of course, meritocratic upper house would have a supermajority of power to override the decisions by the members of the democratic law house, because the members of the democratic law house are only representing the will of the people who are, according to political meritocrats, myopically self-interested, ill-informed, uneducated, lacking public spiritedness. Their argument is very powerful. Look at China. If you go to Sichuan, inland China, still 70% of Chinese population are illiterate. 60% maybe illiterate. They cannot even read. Because we are all fans of democracy, would you entrust the decision-making power to these people who can even read? That's their argument, okay? So that's a political merit. And they tend to, all these proposers of Confucian meritocracy tend to see themselves as a modern Confucian ministers, right? We are followers of Jushi, we are followers of all these Song intellectuals. We are just like, we are exercising our nobility for the sake of well-being of the people. We want help China make a good long-term decision which has profound implications for not only for Chinese people now, but next generations, or people of neighboring countries, including Koreans, Vietnamese, Laos, people in Laos, and New Zealanders as well. So we should make sure that only qualified individuals, so-called virtuous and knowledgeable individuals, are authorized to govern the rest of the people and rest of the world. That's their key argument. Now, the basic assumption here is that meritocracy is based on performance, right? As long as we have right people, virtuous and knowledgeable people, this is independent variable. We're gonna end up having very good public decisions, dependent variables. Performance meritocracy. What makes government legitimate is performance of the select political leaders. It's the causal responsibility, right? Now, what I'm proposing, my question is this. What about after selection? Okay, we selected Xi Jinping. We selected all these members of Politburo, whatever non-democratic means, okay? We selected all these people, trusting so-called their virtue and knowledge, whatever they mean. And however we measure them. Is it because they are smarter than us? Because they are presumably virtuous than us? Then that's it? Only if we identify so-called right individuals and everything's good? Then I say, what about ex post responsibility? What makes our leaders good leaders is not only because of their qualification before election or before selection, but also the way they discharge their responsibility in their position. University administrators, for instance. We have lots of problems, right? I'm associate dean in postgraduate studies. For 6 years, many things happened during political unrest and pandemic and all the leadership change. It's easy to transfer your responsibility to someone below you, right? It's easy because you step in and you initiate all these changes now because you're a good person. Of course, you have a vision for the university, you have a vision for the country. But at the end of the day, you might live here, you might die here, right? You might be sacked here. You never know. You never know what. Somebody got to take responsibility. But who? The junior faculties, the staffers here, students, those people are raising their kids here. You might, we have international people come here. I mean, of course, I'm international scholar in Hong Kong because I'm Korean. But, those people with a proven record can come and go, right? Especially in Hong Kong, Singapore, maybe UK. People come and go. They do a lot of change. They make a lot of change. But they are not held responsible for the change there. Because the change they're making institutionally, in terms of personnel and staff, has long-term consequences. It remains to be seen. And those consequences are borne by the people who stay, right? Anyhow, it's extremely important for the ruler, for the administrator, for the leader to take responsibility. Especially for the problems like natural disasters, pandemics, public health problems, public education, and natural disasters as well, or structural injustice, of course. So I think this is how I summarize these implications. What is important here is that, we tend to think of responsibility in causal terms, right? Causal terms. In criminal justice, of course, it's causal. In Korea, we just removed our president second time, right? 2016, 2017, we removed our president, the former daughter of Park Chung-hee, who was the dictator, but who revolutionized, modernized Korean state and society. She became president simply because she was a daughter of that guy, okay? And people just said, well, 9% GDP growth, the annual growth, 9%, 10%, 11%, that's what his father did. And we want her to do the same. Of course, that does more, right? Anyhow, she basically led her private confidant meddle in public affairs and created all those problems and finally inviting her to be removed from the position. And from same party, we had this new president 3 years ago, and he got fired, basically. And he's now facing criminal sentence. When 3 more minutes, when 2021, when the president who was fired became president during Halloween festivity, we had huge gatherings. Okay, so this downtown Seoul, this alley, small alley, young people are gathered, squeezed into this alley, and they stumble upon themselves and about 159 young Koreans and including several foreign, basically Southeast Asian young youth were choked to death. Okay, they died. But you know what? Halloween festival, Koreans celebrating this festival for years, but nothing like that happened at all. Why that happened? But then we should investigate why police officers or safety personnel were deployed like previous years. Why, all this investigation, nobody was held reliable. Nobody was fired. Nobody was actively assuming responsibility. What president said was, well, why you guys are using this archaic concept, accountable responsibility? None of us, as a president, I didn't cause these people to die. He was a former attorney general, okay? So he's using criminal reasoning. I didn't cause these people. Chief of police didn't cause them to die. The minister of safety didn't cause them. Why you guys, the Korean public, why the journalists are blaming us? That's nonsense. It's an archaic concept of responsibility. But that doesn't ring with the Korean people's sense of responsibility. At the end of the day, of course, he was fired because of other issues. I mean, martial law and all this abuse of power. But many people tend to think that exhibits his leadership, right? The previous one who was fired, the daughter of Park Chung-hee, she was fired because of all this abuse of power. That's the official liberal constitutional reason why she was forced to removed from the position. But 2 years before, prior to that, she did nothing when about 300 people on ferry, especially for school trip, mostly high school students, sang in the west coast of Korea. Sang in this sea, and it was a live broadcast. And then this lady was AWOL for 7 hours. Okay, even now, nobody knows where she was. Okay, and suddenly she showed up. She said, "Oh, could we just give them, life, saving whatever, equipment?" I don't no idea. I mean, and then when she attended this funeral, public funeral, she showed no grief at all. No, she just completely callous to the sufferings of these victims. I mean, even the current one, the president who just fired, he refused to meet the victims' families at all, because it's not on my responsibility. It's not on my business. Because I'm sorry what happened. It's like a natural disaster because it's a misfortune, but it's not matter of justice. Government has nothing to do about them. Government has nothing to. So, that shows, what good leadership is about, what good a government is about. So I think Confucianism is not just about dictatorship. Confucianism is not about, just about harmony over disagreement and difference, diversity. Confucianism is not just about ritually conducting yourself appropriately, especially when you're dealing with, your linear ascendants, or teachers. But it's about responsibility. It's about citizenship. It's about leadership. And I think, I'm not saying Confucianism has all the good things, but I think it's extremely important for East Asians who are forced to give up their culture because the Confucianism and many other traditions were thought to be the single greatest obstacle, standing in the way of their modernizing their state and society 150 years ago, 200 years ago. But I think it's extremely important to rejuvenate this trend of tradition, or not only in order to reconnect our communication channel with our grandparents and great-grandparents. We have little problem communicating with the New Zealanders, Australians, Americans, British people because we are reading same canon. We are getting same education, liberal education. But it's extremely difficult for us. Even I'm over 50, but my generation to have effective communications with my grandparents and great-grandparents because we belong to two different worlds, and we were forced to give up the language through which we communicate with our history and our ancestors. At the same time, it's extremely important to revitalize this tradition. It's part of it because it has really nice insight to teach us, but also, not only East Asians, but also people here attending this lecture. And I think when we are faced with global injustice, structural injustice that arises not only from our active wrongdoing, but also these collective problems, again, this non-causal sense of responsibility that Confucians are talking about could be reappropriated in a positive, in a constructive manner, so that we can, just like we Koreans and Japanese, Chinese people study Aristotle, study Johnson Mill, study Jeremy Waldron, just like that, we can study this as well as a global philosophy, as a human philosophy, so that we can collectively help address the problems that we commonly faced with. If we can do that, I think this type of lecture, the guy out of nowhere talking about Confucianism, may make some relevance to you spending this charitable, very important time at night, evening here with me. If that's the case, then I think I believe I served some purpose of this whole lecture, okay? Okay, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much. My head is spinning. So many things
So
to
many
talk
things.
about. And I would not be surprised if I am not the only one. We have lots of time for questions. Are you okay?
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk, which raises a lot of questions, and that's a real strength. In terms of power and responsibility, how would you view the handling of the COVID pandemic? Because surely there's a responsibility to obviously take care of the health of not just people in China, but East Asia and indeed globally. And how would you assess the handling of it in terms of your framework? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So initially, East Asian countries, South Korea, for instance, and even much South Korean government implemented very vigorous pandemic control, which made many so-called Western audiences in shock because obviously this rigorous, stringent pandemic policies seeming to violate rights and freedoms that are there in Korean laws and constitution. So, but that applies to Japan and Hong Kong, Singapore, and arguably the mainland China as well. But it saved a lot of people, right? It saved the lives of a lot of people. We didn't have a lot of casualties at the end of the day. I'm not sure whether it's a good thing. I mean, I'm not. What I can say here is that why Korean government adopted that kind of policy without creating a lot of social commotion, at least, was because when government exercises power as a responsibility proactively, we don't want constrain the power as such, because it's not just coercive power as such. It's a responsibility by the government. It's a role government is supposed to play actively when people are faced with this type of massive mega problem, right? So we can understand why Japanese Koreans didn't have that kind of conundrum here as seriously as you guys had in New Zealand or Europe, because we have individual human rights on the one hand, we have a public safety on the other, but Koreans, Chinese people tend to think, well, okay, we don't necessarily see this as a the dilemma. Rather, although we do acknowledge our rights and freedoms on jeopardy, it's on the line, but we want government to expand, effectively exercise its responsibility. This is how government uses its coercive power well for the sake of well-being of people. I think that's the major difference between Confucian societies and non-Confucian societies, especially liberal Western societies. And that's how it was quite a little bit difficult for Western liberals to understand, to make sense of the initial steps that Korean, Chinese, or Vietnamese, or East Asian government took, perhaps. Yeah. Thank you.
So my question is more of a historical question, right, about the Confucian tradition. And the problem seems to be there's a lot riding on the personal virtue of either the king, the emperor, or his ministers. And the question is, how do you keep them that way? Because virtue can deteriorate, and it historically does. What are the incentive structures that are supposed to promote virtue and prevent, more importantly perhaps, especially when it comes to government, prevent vice? You didn't talk about that. I wondered if it might sometimes occur in the literature which explains the decay of dynasties. That might be, put down to a decay of virtue in the ruling class. But I wondered if you could expand on that idea.
Right. Great. So scholars of Confucianism, contemporary scholars of Confucianism, as I told you, tend to assimilate, I don't know whether it's the right term, but they might hate this, but assimilate Confucian ethics, Aristotelian ethics, Eudaimonian ethics, right? And what's the motivation? Of course, it's pleasure, deep pleasure, right? You take pleasure, and that's going to be your internal motivation, right? It's a profound pleasure that you can garner, you can glean from being good. But practically, what does that even mean, right? I don't know, but for the rule, of course, your virtue is tightly intertwined with the order and stability of the state. That's your that's in your interest, right? And ministers and people, that's a different question. So they didn't talk a lot about the motivational structure. Of course, sociologically, historically speaking, of course, these elites who are supposed to be virtuous so that they have this power had the right to govern, rule the people. So locally, they are gentries. They possess the land, and they have the local community compact, and they are enjoying relative autonomy from the centralized government, and then they are becoming. But you know, that's how they. But this is a very realistic kind of real political kind of explanation. But there's no, as far as there's no compelling theory for their why they had to immerse themselves in the cultivation of virtue for whole life. It's just what they are supposed to do. This is how you lead a good life. This is what the ancient sages did, and that's exactly what you're supposed to do because you want to emulate them. That they are exemplary models, and you want like them. You become like them. That's the official kind of argument. Of course, the decline of dynasty was already explained in terms of decline of virtue of ruling elites, the rulers, but also the ruling elites as well. Perhaps that's why I think it's important for us to pay renewed interest in, because the Chinese intellectuals and East Asian thinkers also discussed about, institutions and other elements that are very important in political life. But we don't have a lot of theories of those issues, although these things are sporadically discussed. So I think it's important for us to pay renewed attention to that dimension of Confucian political theory. But unfortunately, as far as official discourse is concerned, there is no compelling kind of answer for that. What motivates people to immerse themselves in lifetime process of moral cultivation, except for the fact that these are what ancient sages did, and that's what we should emulate as later followers.
Patrick, and
Yeah, thank you. It's a fantastic talk. Really enjoyed it. A comparison I was thinking of through the talk when you talked about this idea of the king as the paragon of human virtue was something common for a lot of sort of Western European kings, which was the divine right of kings, the idea that your rule was justified by the fact that God chose you to rule. Nowadays, of course, a lot of scholars in the West and probably everyday people in the West look back on that with a lot of skepticism, and Marxists and so on say, well, this is just a kind of excuse that the ruling class made to justify ruling over people. My question is, in sort of East Asia, do scholars or even everyday people look back on this Confucian ideal with a similar sort of skepticism to say, well, of course, the emperors back then said that they were the paragons of human virtue, and that's why they got to rule, and that's why they promoted anyone who said that they were the paragon of human virtue. But you can imagine people being quite skeptical and saying they probably didn't believe any of it. It was just an excuse they made. Or you can imagine people taking it much more seriously and saying, no, those rulers really did take these Confucian ideals to heart and really tried to embody it, even right up to the king himself. So I guess my question is, modern scholars in East Asia, is there this trend of skepticism like you get in the West, or do people look back and think, no, these people really believed in these sort of virtues and these ideals?
Fantastic question. I'm not sure whether the East Asian scholars, especially Confucianism, specialized in Confucianism, would share that skepticism. But they can explain. I'm not sure whether that is skeptical, but they can explain partly the revival of interest in Sunji. As I told you, Sunji was completely sidelined in the Confucian tradition. So we have this staged lineage, Confucius, Mencius, Jushi, all these people. We have this lineage. Chinese people, Korean people like lineage, right? We have, family lineage, family clan, all this history. They create this lineage, intellectual lineage, and lineage of Tao, but from which the Confucian Aristotle was completely excluded, right? But now many scholars pay attention to him, not only because of the problematic that how Sunji, despite his disagreement with Mencius when it comes to the account of human nature, arrived at the virtually same conclusion, because he was also a champion of moral self-cultivation. Even that requires a more rigorous moral self-cultivation, because we lack the sprouts of virtues like benevolence, right? We don't have those sentiments here, right? That's why what makes us bad. It's not like a Augustinian kind of badness of evilness of human nature. But then, because we are lack, we want to reform ourselves through education, through ritual training, so it's called artifice. So there's a kind of interesting similarity between Hume and Sunji. But anyhow, because of some sort of skepticism of this ideal version of Confucian ethics and politics, people paying increasing attention to people like Sunji and Confucians who paid unorthodox Confucians who paid more close attention to the importance of institutions. Okay.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was absolutely brilliant. You may have completely answered this question with Charles, but I would like to revisit the basis in virtue ethics, because at least in my education in philosophy, virtue ethics has been somewhat shaky, or maybe somewhat Western ethics tends to prefer somewhat more grounding, and I would like perhaps a little bit more understanding of how the Eastern way, the East Asian way, allowed for greater variability than perhaps the Western method has.
That's a perennial challenge for students of East Asian philosophy, because we are interrogated by Western friends to say something distinctive about Chinese philosophy, Asian philosophy, Korean philosophy when it comes to virtue or whatever. That's why I use a simulation, right? You know, when you're trained in ethics in Anglophone academic world, especially analytic tradition, then of course you read McDowell, all these people. I mean, you do this Neo-Aristotelian, McIntyre, and all these, and when you read the Chinese philosophy, Mencius, wow, you know, I see the exactly same, almost same thing that Aristotle or Neo-Aristotelians are talking about, right? New intuitionism of sort, taste, connoisseurship, taste, develop taste. That's what sage kingship is about. You have a taste, develop taste for the character of the people, so that and all these things. Because of that problem, some Chinese philosophers are developing or subscribe to special version of role ethics, or in the Chinese tradition, or Sinism, there's no core agent, right? If you start talking about virtue, you should assume the stable agency, right? That's why and then we have a stable moral character traits. And no, in Confucianism, there's no agentic core. It's all about roles. So you build your role. I'm father, I'm husband, I'm son, I'm teacher. You peel off all your roles. At the end of there's nothing there. You're just piles of roles that define you as a human being. But again, I'm not sure whether that's true as well. Okay, I mean, there's huge debate among the students of Chinese philosophy in this regard. But I'm not sure whether which one is right, because I think each part fails to grasp some important dimension of Chinese ethics. And so what is important here is, this is our task, how we capture that dimension of Chinese ethics and politics which cannot be easily made sense of in reference to Western theoretical concepts and frameworks and theories, right? And present it to ourselves and also our Western, I'm sorry to use this, but our Western non-Chinese, non-East Asian audiences in an intelligible way, right? Because you don't know Shenyang, all the Ren, you don't know that those, but so that we can have effective communication. So this is a challenge, but for now, most, basically North American scholars studying Chinese philosophy, especially ethics, moral philosophy, are subscribed to very similar type of virtue ethics of those so developed by neo-Aristotelians, and then the others are completely abandoning the idea of agency and assimilating, in my view, Chinese Confucianism to Buddhism. Or there's no, because it's a synergism. Buddhism, Zhangzhe, Taoism, Confucianism. Chinese people have this kind of shared thing at the center of which lies no agency. But all these people, Mohists, Confucians, and all these people are debating and fighting intellectually over themselves for centuries, for millennia. But we cannot simply say, oh, Chinese people have this shared old global ethic which rejects agency. That I think invites a lot of problems rather than solves. So this is a problem that we have to grapple with. I'm not sure any person can offer a perfect answer for the question that you raised. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks for your talk. It's really interesting. I can't help but wonder, as the economist in the room, I can't help but wonder if you've had thoughts about taking your ideas to the business world. And so you've talked about how your theory predicts differences in governance from east to west. But, all large organizations need governance, and corporate governance rules vary a lot around the world. Do you think you could take steps towards explaining differences in corporate governance between East and West?
Thank you for the question. I am not the right person to talk about the implications of what I said today in the business sector. But there are growing number of scholars in business school who are studying Confucianism and applying this insight to business ethics. So of course, what I can say, there are mushrooming of scholars who have much more intelligence to talk about that topic. But many people tend to pay attention to, of course, ritual propriety and harmony. So of course, our modern corporation and companies are based on rights-bearing individualism, just like how we envision our society. And the conflicts and tensions between the owners and the workers, and also among the workers, and all these problems revolving around labor rights or right to private property, things like that. But many of my colleagues in business ethics tend to pay more attention to the role of ritual. How ritual can help us ameliorate those tensions without invoking rights. And how can we achieve, I don't like this idea of harmony at this term, but still, how can we have more cooperative, maybe fiduciary, it's a religious term, but cooperative relationship among the members of company or business by revitalizing role ethics and the ethic of ritual propriety. So that's what I can say about that. But you might want to check out the literature. There is a huge literature about that dimension of Confucianism. Okay, thank you so much.
He's right there.
Thank you very much. You may have implicitly answered this question by talking about the diversity of views within Confucianism about the self and so on. But what I was going to ask is, does this very attractive Confucian view assume a kind of fairly homogeneous society in which there is widespread agreement about the nature of virtue, as opposed to the kind of liberal society that John Rawls tried to prescribe for, where there are radically different views about what constitutes a good life? Would this work in a much more diverse society?
That's one of the most debated questions among Confucian philosophers. And one of my earlier books is entitled Public Vision Confucianism, Democratic Perfection in Stage and Context. So what I was trying to propose was how to make Confucianism appealing in pluralist society. that increasingly defines East Asia. So to make a long story short, if you go to Korea, I mean, if you go to China, for instance, China is very interesting, mainly in China, because Chinese people, especially intellectuals, actively abandoned the Confucian tradition. May First movement, science and Mr. Science, Mr. Democracy, Confucianism is the single greatest obstacle, basically. And cultural revolution, Confucianism completely demolished, actually. That didn't happen in South Korea, for instance. So if you want to see the remnants of Confucianism as a culture, a social practice, as it was practiced like 500 years ago, South Korea is a place you want to visit, okay? They still preserve that tradition. But point is, if you do survey, I mean, do you identify yourself as Confucian? Then even in South Korea, only less than 0.2% of the entire Korean population would say affirmatively, okay? But you know, here in New Zealand, we have a lot of East Asian, I mean, students of Chinese ancestry, Korean ancestry, second generation, third generation. Still, I think reasonably, the way the parents educate their kids are reasonably, if not exclusively but entirely different from the way the white settlers, that's the right term, but white, liberals educate their kids. If we go to Chinatown and Koreatown in LA or Boston or San Francisco, still, Confucian is not religion per se. It's a social practice. It's how you educate yourself, your children, how you relate yourself with your children, your teachers, your students. That's why it's extremely important for us to embody, cultivate ritual propriety, right? Ritual propriety and filial piety, ancestor worship. All these things are combined to create this constellation of values that define us as reasonably or intelligibly Koreans. Or privately, many Koreans are Presbyterians, many Koreans are Buddhists, many Koreans are Catholics, right? And some of Koreans, many Koreans would say, I'm just a liberal, I have nothing to do with any religion, whatever. But they share a lot in common. They have, when we emphasize ritual propriety, people rarely raise any question about that. Of course, as a human being, that's how you conduct yourself in front of the public, in front of older people or younger people. Filial piety, even in court, Korean constitutional court, when all these problems, family laws or at issue, still justice is all liberal-minded. Justice say, filial piety is the greatest human virtue. No American judges and justice would say that in public, right? In writing. But, so even if you're feminist, we're going to side with you so that, all these unjust elements of a Korean family will be dismantled and abolished. But it doesn't mean that thereby we abandon filial piety, all these ritual propriety, all these things, because these are important values for us, Koreans, blah, 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 blah. No feminist, as far as I can tell, raise active opposition to that kind of judgment. So all these things are broadly shared by Koreans and Vietnamese and Taiwanese. Of course, therefore, shortly, it's unthinkable to think about dual identity. I'm Muslim Baptist. I'm Muslim Calvinian or Muslim Lutheran. Doesn't make any sense. Or I'm Calvinian Lutheran. I'm Mennonite, Amish. Doesn't make any sense, right? It's oxymoronic. But people can easily say, I'm Christian, Korean Christian, Confucian. I'm Confucian Christian. Because you have this denominational belief in certain doctrines, but Confucian is not defined in terms of doctrine, in terms of practice, the way you conduct yourself. So you have a bunch of Koreans, a bunch of Vietnamese and Chinese who have nothing to do with Confucianism, but then the way they conduct their lives, the way they engage with their families is quite different from the way you engage your children, your intimate ones. So we can think about a variety of kinds of Confucian political theory. I cannot go into all detail, but variety of kinds of Confucian theory in the pluralist and multicultural social context, rather than, we have to all subscribe to one doctrine of Confucianism, whether it's Mengshan, or it's Confucian, or Sunjian, that's gone. Nobody would say that. But it's up to us, theorists, how to reconstruct Confucianism in a way that is appealing to especially young generation, because who do not believe in the monolithic and monistic structure of Confucianism that defines our society. That's gone. Okay, so many Confucian political theorists are struggling with that question seriously.
Hi, thank you very much for a wonderful talk. If we equate, for argument's sake, Confucianism with social responsibility, this comes from a place of completely not knowing, and we say in an Eastern culture, like you mentioned, South Korea, if there is increased social responsibility amongst everybody, because these are values that everybody takes part in, is there less abuse of power? Do you have less businesses, for instance, doing the wrong thing? Do you have less of poor leadership and those kind of things in South Korea?
Absolutely. That's why I think one thing I really don't like about some of my friends in my field, narrowly defined, is that they want to just reject Western tradition. They want to just revitalize Chinese, especially Chinese tradition, as if we Chinese, I'm not Chinese, but we Chinese are victims of colonialism, all these things, imperialism, whatever, and we want to regain our power, reclaim our right place in the world, blah, blah, and we want to proliferate the idea of harmony over idea of justice. Justice is bad, harmony is good, virtue is good, but institution is bad. I think it's a terrible idea, actually. Look at me. I mean, all these people are still using smartphones, okay? All these people are, wear glasses and, when they come to Dunedin, I mean, they take Air New Zealand, whatever. I mean, it's just nonsensical for some people to say that we have to go beyond the West or go beyond the East. I think it's a terrible idea. We need institutions. We need a good theory of justice. We need a good theory. We need the roads. We need the working. We need the harbour master. We need the wardrobe. We need the meal. We need the rights. We need good theories, division of power, constitutionalism. These are things we East Asians failed, but paid less regard to, or less attention, right? Little attention. So at the same time, I think, mainstream Western political theory, theory of justice, or institutions, how to make institutions just, right? Rather than individual justice. This is an archaic Italian justice. It's gone. Now it's about deontology, all this, or utilitarianism, universal theories, right? Universal justice that applies to our whole system. Again, that's important, but when we are emphasizing those universal top-down, universal principles of justice, we sometimes gloss over. I mean, something that is very important. Very, very vital. So I think Confucianism can provide us important insight. I'm not saying Confucianism can replace Western traditional Republican liberalism, vice versa. So I think the something that we lack here is, of course, the attention to intricacy of institution, how institution can help people become not only ordered but also virtuous. Institutions are extremely important. And Confucians paid little attention to the symbiotic relationship between virtue and agency and institutions. I think institutions, power, I think that dimension we East Asians should learn actively. But at the same time, I hope that my Western friends can learn, read intellects of Confucius or Mencius Sunzi openly, and then they can gather something insightful. My son is here, the society that I'm envisioning when I ventured into this business in the first place, it was that I want my son and their children to read Plato and Confucius, read Aristotle and Mencius, read Kant and Jushi without embarrassment. Because even my generation, we were completely soaked in, all Western canon, okay? People know Aristotle, Plato, Rawls, Mill, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, but people don't know. People even in Korea, in Japan, don't know how to pronounce those names, right? Big names in our intellectual. I think that's completely problematic. So as long as we learn, and then we Roald Dahl, and we also read Korean, stories and narratives, all the Aesop, then perhaps the kind of people that we are reinventing, right? Fully immersed in both traditions. Perhaps then we can have a very global citizens. We are still, who are still soaked in saturated Korean values or New Zealand values, but then global, cosmopolitan enough that we have a very meaningful communications and deal with the common problems together. That's what I'm envisioning, rather than, we Chinese people, Korean people, we have to reclaim this and fight against the Western liberals. That's not really productive way. So I think those these dimensions of theory and discourse we should learn, Okay, it's because we don't have enough discourse in our tradition. Okay, thank you.